So, welcome again, guys. Thank you so much for being here in my absence. I'm here with my friend and brother pastor, Paul Carter. Paul pastors at Cornerstone Baptist in Orillia, Ontario. And he has a unique perspective on church partnership, having moved from one to the other. And I want to kind of walk through that, investigate that a little bit as we start this morning. Maybe Paul, maybe introduce yourself real briefly, brother, and then what might be helpful just to lay the groundwork is where do we find church-to-church partnership in Scripture? Everything we do needs to have a scriptural basis. So, as you look through the New Testament, maybe particularly the Book of Acts, where do you find that spirit of church-to-church partnership, and why is that so important as an outworking of the gospel?
Right. Well, in terms of introduction, my name is Paul Carter. I'm the lead pastor at Cornerstone Baptist Church in Orillia. I'm on the executive council for TGC Canada, and I'm the host and Bible teacher of Into the Word. I'm married. I have 5 kids, 2 dogs, and a squirrel that I'm trying to get out of my soffit. So that's a personal introduction. In terms of the answer to your first question there, first of all, I would say I'm a Baptist by conviction and by upbringing, and I assume I'm talking to a group of Baptists. So I probably don't have to say too much to convince you of local church autonomy, in the sense that, yeah, I believe that congregations are responsible for their own life and ministry, that they should be responsible for their pulpit ministry. They should hire their senior pastor, their preacher. They should hold the pulpit accountable to their statement of faith. They should be responsible for a budget. They should participate in church discipline. Fundamentally, that's the difference between us, say, and Anglicans or Presbyterians. In the Anglican or Presbyterian model, we all believe that there's got to be church discipline, right? Like, I think our Protestant roots would suggest that to be a proper church, you got to have proper preaching of the gospel. You got to have proper ordinances and sacraments, and you got to have proper discipline. Now, our Presbyterian and Anglican friends, they kind of outsource that to the session or to the bishop. And what's distinctive about us as Baptists is we say, no, actually, the local church is responsible for that. The local church needs to excommunicate. In essence, we need to say, hey, listen, we cannot credit your profession of faith. Your conduct suggests that you're not truly regenerate. So I believe that. That being said, we've also typically believed in what's called free will association. Free will association is the fact that we could choose to partner with other churches in the pursuit of the Great Commission, and so we typically have. And now, in terms of, well, what biblical justification do we find for all that? Well, you do see, as you read through the book of Acts, I'm preaching actually right now through the Acts of the Apostles, and you see churches partnering there all over the place. In Acts 11, the church in Antioch is aware of a famine that's going to disproportionately affect the church in Jerusalem, so they send money with delegates. And then again, you see it in the Jerusalem offering. Probably that's the main example that I would point to in Acts, where churches in Greece, in Macedonia and Achaia, are going to partner together to gather up these funds, because it appears that there were all these widows and not just widows, but pilgrims who were getting converted and then just kind of parking in Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem all of a sudden was responsible for this fairly massive benevolence program. And rather than just have one church funding the entire, missional benevolence program of Christendom, all the churches got together and say, hey, let's share this burden. Let's do this together. And so there you see churches, working together. Paul mentions that some of his church planting efforts were funded by other churches in other regions. So he talks about how the Philippians helped him to plant in Thessalonica. So we see church planting, we see benevolence, and then we see, of course, we think of the Jerusalem Council, I guess, too, in Acts 15, where churches all got together to decide difficult issues, to collaborate on a doctrinal threat. So, collaborating over new doctrinal threats, collaborating over benevolence need, collaborating over church planting. We see that in the pages of the New Testament. So I don't think there's necessarily any argument. Well, I don't think there's any coherent argument against it. It really comes down to, is it compulsory or is it something you choose, and how does that work, and et cetera, et cetera.
That's very helpful, Paul. I appreciate that. So when you came on to Cornerstone, it was part of a different association, the CBOQ. Out here in Atlantic Canada, it'd be COBAC, but similar sort of conventions. Um, How embedded was that in the DNA of the congregation? How important was that to you? You kind of inherited that, as I understand it. Um, so what was that like church life? Like were they deeply aware of their association with Kobach? Was it more of a loose connection? Walk me just a little bit through the history of Cornerstone's sort of previous association, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I'll just back it up just a bit and say I grew up in an independent Baptist church, which is interesting, right? Because we've just talked about association and all that kind of stuff. So it was a Baptist church that was founded by a retired fellowship Baptist pastor, and I don't actually know why the church never ended up joining the fellowship. It just never did. And then when I was a teenager, it affiliated with the AGC. I don't know if you have that out in Atlantic, Canada. It's Associated Gospel Churches, basically independent Baptist churches that associate together for various purposes. And we only did that because the pastor we hired was the moderator of the AGC, and that was a requirement of us hiring him. So, I kind of grew up as an independent Baptist without a lot of association links. And then started off pastoring. I was a youth pastor in the fellowship. And because I didn't really grow up in the denominations, I didn't realize, that there were, good Baptists and bad Baptists or whatever. I knew that there were Baptists who associated more formally than other Baptists. And so I ended up working actually in both Baptist denominations here in Ontario without much of an awareness of the history there. And then when I was sort of feeling called to be a lead pastor, I interviewed with a bunch of churches, certainly did not have like a denominational label. I was basically just talking to good churches, and there were good churches in both denominations. So I ended up here in Orillia at what was at the time called First Baptist Church, Orillia, and it was and still is a very good conservative, even they, small R Reformed. This church has great roots. It was originally called Orillia Regular Baptist Church. So for those of you who know that nomenclature, in North America, Reformed Baptist churches were typically called regular Baptist churches. This as opposed to General Baptist Church. This church was founded by a particular Baptist English pastor. So Reformed Baptists in England were called particular Baptists. So it had lots of good roots. It was never a part of the split that happened in the 20s and 30s between the fellowship and the CBOQ, as we call it, the convention. Because that was mostly a Toronto Hamilton, Golden Horseshoe kind of thing. And we're about an hour north of that on the highway, an hour by car. And so we were just kind of out of the loop. And so this church actually more or less functioned as an independent Baptist church. We participated in the mission arm of the CBOQ, like CBM, but we didn't have a lot to do with the regional denomination. And that was because we had a pastor in the 60s who was very influential here, who actually planted the church that Steve Bray is sort of derived from in Newfoundland. But anyways, this guy was very influential in the history of our church. He was here for over 20 years. And he basically told us not to have anything to do with the denomination because he said it was drifting leftward. So by the time I got there, it was functioning as an independent Baptist church with missional associations through CBM. However, when the denomination started drifting on LGBTQ issues, and our elders became aware of that, they said to me in a meeting, "What are we doing in association with these guys? Let's just go." And I said, "Well, we've been in partnership with these people for almost 150 years." I said, "Maybe we should put some effort into renewal work and see what kind of strength there is out there in the group." And they said, "Okay." And they agreed to fund that for 10 years. So for 10 years, we basically funded a renewal movement called Clara that had about 20 or 30 churches, depending on how you count affiliation with Clara. And that's about how many Reformed-ish churches there were left in the CBOQ. We had great fellowship together. We tried to get some motions in place that would force the denomination to police churches and pastors that were drifting on LGBTQ issues. We actually ended up doing better than we thought. We thought we would lose spectacularly when those motions hit the floor. And instead we lost by a fairly thin margin. Most of the motions were voted down by 55 to 45 margin. And that happened over 2 consecutive assemblies. I won't bore you with the long story there, but we took that as a clear signal. Hey, these folks have made their decision. They're not interested in holding the ground on biblical sexuality and gender. So at that point, we disaffiliated, and then we didn't want to be independent. We didn't want to be a free-floating Baptist church. So we made the decision to affiliate with our blood cousins, the fellowship, and that's worked out pretty well.
Yeah, and I find that so helpful and fascinating because that's part of even the history of the fellowship, at least in Ontario, is a lot of guys in Atlantic Canada said, well, the issue is association. That's what the problem is. So moving forward, we're not going to associate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet, in the birth of the fellowship in the early 50s in Ontario, and with you guys, so you had a heartbeat as elders to say association's not the problem, it's just who you associate with, maybe.
Yeah.
And but we can't just sort of be a rogue, like, non-entity or an independent entity, I should say.
Yeah.
There's benefit here. So maybe just walk us through, so that process, you walked into Clara perhaps not expecting that you were going to change the denomination. I mean, I certainly commend you and have commended you for making that attempt, and the fact that it got as close as it did is amazing. But after that, that was sort of like a watershed moment for you guys as a congregation and other congregations as well. Yeah, maybe just walk us through then that process of, we got it, we have to associate with somebody, so let's investigate what that might look like.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my perspective on association is kind of the same as my perspective on authority. Like, the answer to bad authority is not no authority, it's good authority. And I would say the same about association. The answer to bad association is not no association, it's good association. And this is why, actually, I think, the Baptists thread the needle on this. I wouldn't want to be an Anglican or a Presbyterian, for the simple reason that when your denomination goes down, they're going to take you with them. They're going to drag you down, because the connection is so concrete. It's so fixed and steady. Like, you as a Presbyterian church, you can't say to your session, no, we don't want that pastor. As an Anglican church, you can't say to your bishop, no, we don't want that pastor. But as a Baptist, you hire your own pastor, so you can be as conservative as you like. And that's why there were still, 30 or 40 Reformed Baptist churches in the CBOQ, even though the denomination as a whole had drifted leftward, because we don't care. They don't own our building. They don't hire our pastors. They ask us to send them money, and we often don't. So, like, it's a free will association. You pay as you play and play as you like. And I think that's good, because in essence, that allowed us to let go. When they started going down, we said, don't go down. And we had a 10-year conversation about why this would not end well, but they were bound and determined. So we let go and we carried on. Now, that being said, that again, I don't think that's an argument for not associating. I think that's an argument for Baptist association. Baptist association allows you to disengage when it's no longer helpful. And so we've partnered with the fellowship. We've found great utility there already. I would say, particularly in the area of pastor training and development, the FEB, I don't know how it is in Atlantic Canada with the FEB. It's always been a bit confusing to me. I know that, like, in Ontario, there are more fellowship churches than convention churches, but as I understand it, in Atlantic Canada, it's maybe the opposite. It's more convention churches than fellowship. So I don't know if they'll still be true for you, but for us, there was immediate utility in the area of pastor training and development. They have lots of meetings that we can go to, lots of workshops. They have retreats. So that's great. And then their mission stuff, we had moved out of CBM probably about 12 years ago as a priority mission partner, and we were kind of free agents mission wise. So, partnering with this project here and this project there, but we've started to pick up some fellowship projects, and we found them gospel sound and good projects. So we're enjoying that part of it as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I think that was another sort of direction that I wanted to go. We probably covered those bases, but we've formed an official partnership between Fellowship Atlantic and Feb Central. We had Tom Haynes at our last regional
Oh, yeah.
conference, and we found that to be quite helpful, and just the resources that are available. But as you mentioned, it is sort of the level of association even is determined by the local church in that sense.
Yeah.
So we're in on these things, but yeah, and so that you can maintain that balance of autonomy with association and still do some really good things. Maybe lastly, as we kind of land the plane, then Paul, you mentioned previously that the pastor back in the '60s was instrumental in sort of planting the church where Steve Bray is, and it's been
That's right.
interesting and beautiful to see Cornerstone now partnering with Mile One Mission and those kind of things. So, where else has church partnership been not just of benefit? Because I mean that's again a bit of utilitarian language, but where has that been helpful to promote the gospel for you guys in particular at Cornerstone as you partner as a church with other churches or like-minded churches and organizations? How has that advanced the cause of the gospel and even impacted your own people with a better understanding of what the gospel looks like as it's fleshed out?
Well, are you, just to clarify so I can be helpful here, are you thinking denominational partnerships or other?
Both. So inner with the fellowship. You mentioned some of those, but even
Yep.
just beyond. As I was talking with Paul yesterday, he mentioned sort of the Hogtown Fellowship, the
Yep.
Gospel Toronto Gospel Alliance, and even those are at different levels. Just a helpful conversation that
Yeah, sure.
when you have that sense of we're not alone in Aurelia, but we're part of something bigger.
Yeah.
How does that look, and what has that done for the congregation to help them better understand the gospel and the implications of it? I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. So I'll maybe move from the general to the specifics. I would say in general, I think church partnership, free will association is a good thing, and it's a safe thing, it's a healthy thing, it's an effective, and it's an efficient thing. Bottom line is there are just certain things you can't do on your own. The Great Commission is a big thing, and there are aspects of that task that are really tough for you to do on your own as a local church. Like the most obvious example would be seminary training. Like, how are you going to train pastors? Like, do you have enough staff to have a full-time Greek instructor on staff? Like, how are you going to do this? Right. So it makes a ton of sense for 10 or 20 or 50 churches to partner together to operate a seminary. That's just obvious. Or we think, the original impetus for churches partnering together was mission. So I'm sure we've all heard the story of the Andrew Fuller and William Carey and these guys, and they put 5 particular Baptist churches. I think they came together and they said, all right, to William Carey, you go down the well, so to speak, and we'll hold the rope. And that's because no one church can send a staff member to India for 10 years. Like, that's not a thing. So it's going to take a couple churches working together. So seminaries, missionary organizations, and then to that I would add, administration stuff like pastor benefits. You get it's just not to be too mundane, but you get a better price in your benefits if you get 20 or 30 or 40 churches in a pool as opposed to one church. And so there's just efficiency on all that kind of stuff. Employment standards. I know the fellowship here, I would assume this is the same for Atlantic Canada. The fellowship here just recently updated their sort of pay scale, which has been really helpful. I still think there's ways to go for all of us to adjust to the changes in the economy, but the fellowship is trying to help churches here realize they're going to pay pastors better if they're going to have pastors. And so that kind of stuff is helpful at the denominational level. But then, I think denominations are going to continue to exist, should the Lord tarry, for the next 100 years. I think that denominations are always going to be a part of that for those kinds of things. It takes a lot of agreement. It takes basically in total and entire agreement in order to run a seminary. Like I'm in the Gospel Coalition, but I could not co-fund a seminary with a bunch of Presbyterians and evangelical Anglicans. That's not, no. I need my guys to learn why we do baptism the way we do. I need my guys to learn why we do church discipline the way we do. So we're going to need our own seminary. And so, denominations are going to be useful for that kind of stuff that requires total agreement. Church planting, pastor training, those 2 things come immediately to mind. But then there's other types of association where you don't need total agreement. You just need gospel agreement. And I mentioned I'm on the Gospel Coalition Canada, so that's helpful. I just sent out some resources today because we've got churches trying to figure out this whole Israel thing and blah, blah, blah. And how do we do that? And so just if we can collaborate through some of these networks, it's just going to save each other some time and effort and just help each other minister at a higher level. So I believe in that. And then locally, we run here a preaching workshop where we have guys from a handful of churches, 4 or 5, sometimes as many as 6, but where we get together, we read a preaching manual together. So we're always reading a book. Right now we're reading Preachers and Preaching by Lloyd Jones. And then we workshop our manuscripts together. And so guys can help each other. And hopefully that results in better gospel preaching. One of the guys yesterday from one of the other churches said, in essence, this has kept him from preaching a lot of bad sermons. because, collectively, all the books we've read, all the training we've had in that workshop come to bear on any particular manuscript. And so if anybody spots something that's out of bounds, like, hey, maybe you've overstated this point because I think you're drifting into something here, it's functioning like bumper rails. And so it's helping them keep laser focused on the gospel, helping them be faithful and true, helping them feed his people good food without a lot of mixture and nonsense. And so that's just something we're doing at the local level. And again, free will, nobody has to come. And you can reject my counsel as much as you like. It's all free, right? And you can do with it what you like. But the guys are finding it helpful. This kind of partnership, I think, helps us do a better job preaching the gospel locally and across this country too.
Yeah, that's so good. And like again, the levels there, and it's so helpful. I'll just give the last word then to your brother, and maybe in particular, and this wasn't one of the questions beforehand, but say you're a guy, you're in Orillia, that's sort of Muskoka, cottage country, not dissimilar from some of the areas around here. You have a passion for church partnership, church association. You've mentioned the preaching workshops, other ministries besides the local church ministry that you're doing. Maybe just a good word on where would you begin? I mean, in a sense, we have 19 congregations in Fellowship Atlantic, so that's a really good place to not only start but to continue to fully participate in. But what are some other things maybe that guys could do to foster that sense of camaraderie and church to church partnership?
Yeah, I think I'd identify those same three levels. I'd say locally, look for other pastors within driving distance of your church, guys that you could legitimately meet at a Tim Hortons, or look to build a fellowship of 3, 4, 5, 10 churches locally that are evangelical. They don't all have to be Baptists. Like we had an Alliance guy at our preaching workshop. We've had different folks from different churches. They are actually right now they're all Baptist guys, but we've had an Alliance guy in our preaching workshop before. It doesn't have to be that rigid. In our pastoral fellowship, we have these pastoral fellowship lunches. We've had evangelical Anglicans. We've had other folks involved there. So I would say look to build a local network for fellowship. There's stuff you can do together at the local level, whether it's canned food drives. There's a out of the cold thing here that all that can be very helpful at the local level, and you can just organize that yourselves. And I just think that's helpful from a fellowship perspective. If you build a preaching workshop, which I think is a great idea, it's just going to be good for your preaching. And again, if they're evangelical guys, their perspectives are going to help keep you focused on the gospel. That's great. And then I would say at the regional level, you should be connected to a denomination. Like here in Ontario and Quebec, we're all in a giant benefit pool. We're all getting help, and I would say there's safety in that too, right? Because if for the local congregation too, if your pastor starts to go sideways, where do you turn for help? Nice, and that happens from time to time. So nice to be able to call in you mentioned Tom Haynes and just say, hey Tom, here's what my pastor's saying. Is that a thing that pastors should say? Or here's what he's doing online. Is that a thing that pastors should do? And I think that's just really helpful, particularly in our climate. I'll tell you, we've seen a lot of pastors going sideways over the last 3 years. Nice to be in a church where there's some appeal process or somebody you can reach out to for help at least. So I think there's loads of reasons to be at the regional level connected to your denomination. And then I would say at the national level, the internet's an amazing thing. You're in PEI. I'm just north of Toronto here. Here we are having a conversation over the internet. And actually, and later today, I'm meeting with a group of pastors in Texas at 2:00. The internet's amazing in that sense. Like it's also awful. The internet is the worst thing and the best thing to ever happen. Take advantage of that and get connected nationally. A body like TGC Canada has been great for me. I went into it, to be honest with you, when I joined TGC, I was 40 years old. And I was having a real hard time finding 60-year-old pastors who would mentor me, because 60-year-old pastors are either gearing down or maximally busy. And I asked a bunch of guys, couldn't get. So I joined TGC to hang out with, John Mahaffey and John Neufeld. That was it. Now all of a sudden I'm the old fart that the young, I don't know if and you can say fart in the Maritimes, but I'm the old guy that everybody kind of wants to just hang around with. That's great. That's that's what these groups are for. Just fellowship, collaboration, sharpening each other's swords. It's a real blessing.
So good, brother. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And I know the guys do as well. And we'll break now and have some discussion. So thank you so much, Paul. Appreciate it, brother.
All right, thanks. Bless you guys.